So I'm just going to wait a few moments to make sure that we've got people on these virtual seats, and we'll kick off from there. Let's just give it a few minutes. I'm just watching the participant numbers go up. When they start to stabilize, we'll get going. In the meantime, we've got Tracy in the background doing captions for us, so you should be able to see those popping up at the bottom of the screen there. So the numbers are still rising, so just give it a couple more minutes. Okay, so I think the numbers are starting to slow down now, so I will formally start the webinar. So welcome to how to create an inclusive workplace, which is the topic of our webinar today. As I said, we've got a fantastic lineup of panelists, and we'll introduce you to those in a bit more depth later. But from the top, we've got Peter from VERCIDA. I hope I've said that right. Peter, give me a thumbs up.
Yes, you have.
Heather from the National Trust, our own Teresa Loftus, and myself, Sarah. I'm from the marketing team. I'm mostly here to drive the slides, give a bit of intro, and my colleague Sophie is watching the Q&A in the background and supporting me today. So thanks to her, and thanks to Tracy again for providing the captions. So we'll move on. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping before we start. As I said, we've got live captions, which are popping up on screen. We do ask people to use the Q&A window for any questions. That could be technical queries, or it could be questions from the panelists as we go on. We've turned the chat window off. A couple of reasons for that. One is it's just easier for us to have one channel, but there is a very solid accessibility reason as well. Anyone who is using a screen reader will find that everything that goes in the chat is read out, and that can be a little bit distracting, which we found from experience. After the webinar, everybody will be sent an email that will include slides, a transcript, and a recording. So you'll be able to watch at your leisure, and you'll be notified via email. Apologies, my dog is now barking. And there'll be a follow-up email for any feedback as well. The panelists, as I've said, we've got Peter from VERCIDA, Heather from the National Trust, and Teresa, who's part of our assessment team at AbilityNet. So just to say formally welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for giving up your time to be with us today. In terms of an agenda, I'm briefly just going to set the scene with a few statistics around inclusion in the workplace, what the landscape looks like, how COVID has started to shift that landscape, and to give a bit of an introduction to who we are at AbilityNet. Then this, I've just said it's in the wrong order, but I will then pass over to Teresa, who's going to expand on that theme of the changing landscape and what AbilityNet can provide in that space. Then we'll hand over to Peter, and he'll introduce us to VERCIDA. The National Trust will be talking about how they are adapting. We'll hear from Heather about the diverse range of not just workforce, but workplaces that she's managing in terms of that accessibility piece. And then we've got a few questions for panel discussion, but please do pop any of your own questions in the Q&A, and we'd be very happy to come to those at the end as well. So I'll just give you a brief overview of AbilityNet as a whole, and Teresa will go into some of the more detail on workplace services later. So our mission is that we believe in a digital world accessible to all. And there are a number of ways that we go about achieving that mission. So we offer a range of services for individuals at home, at work and in education. The focus for this webinar is on workplace services. And as I said, we'll hear more about that later. Our revenue comes from selling accessibility products and services. And that's looking at how we can facilitate people to make websites more accessible for everyone. We offer a range of consultancy services. We also run 2 annual events, Tech for Good and TechShare Pro. TechShare Pro is the biggest meetup of accessibility professionals in the UK and will be taking place in November. We've got some amazing sponsors. It's all about keeping that conversation going and looking at how we can make sure that the digital world is genuinely accessible to people with disabilities. So in terms of the changing working landscape, as I said, I just wanted to present a few statistics that just sets the scene there. So one thing that has happened in terms of COVID is that the disability employment gap has increased. There's been a lot of discussion online about the fact that disabled people have actually been disproportionately disadvantaged by COVID. It's a huge population of people. There are 8.4 million disabled people of working age in the UK, which accounts for 20% of the working age population. So it's really important that we're having this conversation today and that we keep that going. Unfortunately, the unemployment rate is for disabled people is far higher than people who are not disabled. We would say that accessibility, digital accessibility, while it doesn't fix all of that, is part of that diversity and inclusion agenda, and we'll be looking at that today. And as I said, disabled people were disproportionately affected by the pandemic, be it through a loss of income, furlough or redundancy. In terms of the new normal, which is a phrase I'm sure we've all heard a lot, there's been a real shift to people working at home, and I know that's a thread Teresa and others will be looking at. In terms of going forward, it's something that working adults have embraced. 85% want to use a hybrid approach of working at home and in the office. Business less sure about how to go about it, a little bit of reticent there, that 32% of businesses are not sure what proportion of the workforce will be working from their usual place of work. So it's definitely a transition. And again, digital accessibility and digital has a place within that conversation. This is a graph on screen, which just shows the impact of different stages of the pandemic and how that impacted people traveling to work and working from home. And you can see that there are particular spikes and troughs relating to lockdown, winter restrictions, when the government published its roadmap. So just again, reinforcing that this has very genuinely accelerated this conversation and made it very real and very alive. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Teresa, who's the expert in this space from AbilityNet. So Teresa, you've been with us for a long time and got a lot of expertise. I'll hand over to you to just introduce yourself, say hi, and then I'll drive the slides.
Hello. So thank you, Sarah. My name is Teresa Loftus and I'm the assessment team manager at AbilityNet, and I deliver workplace assessments and disabled student assessments. And so I've been working with AbilityNet for around about 10 years, but prior to that I worked in education, working with blind and visually impaired children for around about 12 years. So it's quite some time that I've been working with assistive technologies and the ergonomics of the workplace as well. So we can go forward onto the next slide, Sarah. So really I'm here to talk to you about the impact and how it's of COVID and how it's affected us in the workplace. So for AbilityNet, we had to adapt very quickly as well. So COVID has meant that for many disabled people who had previously travelled to work, they were suddenly finding themselves working from home. And for some, this was a positive change that enabled them to manage their conditions in a more effective way whilst working. For instance, less travelling meant less fatigue for individuals with conditions such as fibromyalgia or social anxiety. For others, there was an increased need in learning new online tools and how to adapt and implement these to continue working collaboratively and productively without barriers. As such, that meant line managers needed to learn new tools as well to implement supportive strategies and tools to ensure everybody interacted fairly and equally. And employees needed to utilise mechanisms to enable support to be applied. And that needed to be done quite quickly to start off with. It was no longer an option to rely on a colleague to ask for support. Normally we'd turn to the side and ask for somebody to help us, and that wasn't there anymore. And so learning new technology, regardless of disability, was essential to keeping business running. So our shift in support at AbilityNet, we were quick to adapt to these new working ways. Everybody in AbilityNet became a home worker themselves, setting up offices in their bedrooms, in the kitchens and spare rooms, and in AbilityNet provide workplace adjustments. So we were more than able to provide advice to our team to help maintain reasonable working adjustments and practices. We quickly trained staff to assess remotely and implement the use of video calls to deliver our workplace services. And AbilityNet successfully met that demand. Our clients, for instance, welcomed the opportunity to see and talk to people, many of whom were isolated at home themselves. And we were able to share screens to demonstrate software that we might be recommending, so that provided choice for people. And we provided links to resources for them to view as well. So we kept all that continuous support and advice available to them and realistic. This enabled clients to understand how they could be supported in order to continue with their work. These were AbilityNet's strengths, and AbilityNet understood the challenges that were faced. We've been a driving force in the field of technology, accessibility and inclusion since 1998, and there's a little bit of history as well on our website about AbilityNet and our background, and it's really worth sort of investigating that too. Our services include free support for individuals at home, workplace services, educational services, and digital accessibility as well. The next slide, Sarah, please. So the pros and cons. So we've now got this hybrid working office, and that means people are maybe working at home, in the office, or a bit of both. And there's some pros and cons to that. So COVID has highlighted the usefulness of assistive technologies, many of which have become the norm due to the nature of online communication and collaboration and interaction. So using video conferencing and cloud-based services means that we can all work across a wide geographical area without needing to physically hit base on a daily basis. However, this means that there will be a mixture of people working from home and office that need to work together. And the pros and cons of this means that communication and interaction becomes a little more complex. So it might mean that managing meetings is a little bit more difficult, trying to make sure that it's fair and equal for everybody to participate, not intruding on home lives during virtual meetings, and the boundaries between home and work life become a little bit blurred. It's also about knowing and understanding the collaborative tools that work for everybody, regardless of disability. So we now need to consider whether the office tools and locations accommodate all regardless of disability. And so you'll need to think about both the virtual and the physical barriers for this as well, because that's what hybrid working is about. So virtual meetings, for instance, you might need to consider how somebody maybe with a hearing loss needs to interact when we're on video calls, whether your colleagues use specialist assistive technologies and whether you've got the right platform that you need to use, and how you need to adapt maybe videos that you might be implementing too. So these things all have a big impact when people are using different assistive technologies or they have disabilities that impact on their ability to access some of these tools. It might be that you've got people who are struggling to actually come on to the video calls due to anxiety. So considering how they need to work too, it's really important to make those adjustments to make sure that everybody's included. There's still a need for face-to-face meetings as well, and those are the physical barriers that some people could experience, and it's keeping those in mind. So, you know, are those physical barriers? We might have changed offices during COVID, you know, might have downsized to a different size office. You still need to consider those doorways, the doors and the ramps to make things accessible. And do you have sort of reserved seating at meetings for people who might need to sit at the front or in specialist positions to access BSL interpreters, for instance? And whether you've included things like using loops in your meeting areas as well. So hybrid working also means about the collaborative tools that we're using. So again, we need to consider the assistive technology, the free and the paid for, and how everybody will use them. They provide a great opportunity to work at the same time and at different times, on and offline. And for example, Microsoft Teams has been really useful for a lot of people. And it means that they can sort of keep momentum going with project work and include the diversity of the workforce, regardless of location and disability. Sarah, did you want to go on to the next slide? So AbilityNet have quite a comprehensive range of tools that can help support people. So you might want to use something like My Computer My Way, which will help people set up their computer settings to make them quickly, easily to use, regardless of disability. So that might be that they are using a computer, it might be using that they're using tablets or their phones. So My Computer My Way will help instruct them as to the types of things that can be made accessible by accessing the settings on their computers or their devices. If you're unsure as an employer about the types of support for some disabilities as well, the fact sheets are a really good starting point for you. So go to those, and then you can then identify the types of things that would be useful. So going from fact sheets, and then you can then dip into the My Computer My Way to see how you can adapt environments. We've also got the training options there. Again, that's something that you need to sort of think about from not only the employee side of things, but maybe having people within in the office that can provide that buddy support or a go-to person that knows and understands about the disabilities. So the AbilityNet have a wide range of training resources available to you, the e-learning, the webinars, and if you go on, you can see the huge range that we have. So there's how you can create inclusive, accessible meetings, collaborative working environments, and inclusive and accessible culture and individual work plans. As I said, the e-learning is a great tool because you can actually access those in your own time and at a pace that you want to. Then beyond that, it's really important to understand that not everything's free, and an organisation might need to access some specialist support that is quite costly at times. Now, that's not just about the assistive technologies, it could be about sort of the ergonomics or even travelling to and from work or providing buddy support from somebody. Access to Work is a really great resource. It's a government funded scheme and not really utilised as much as it should be, maybe because people don't know about it. And that's well worth looking at. We have a fact sheet on that. If you're not sure about it, please do dip into it. And then for the employer and the employee, we've got Clear Talents as well, which is a way of identifying types of support that can be useful to each individual and looks at their specific needs too. Okay, so that's me and my section. Did you want to move on, Sarah, to the next slide?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks ever so much, Teresa. I know there's a lot of information in there. The slides will be made available afterwards, and with all these useful links in. Lots to cover in there, lots about choice, I think was the theme that was coming through for me, that choice of access, whether it be working at home, working online, and just really tapping into all the different tools within the various available platforms, which give people choice about different ways of holding online meetings. I'm sure those are trends that we'll come back to when we have our panel discussion. But yeah, I'll move on and call on you, Peter, to tell us all about VERCIDA Group and yourself. So I'll move forward and you can say hi. I know you've got a breadth of experience in this area. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a bit about your background, and I know you're super passionate, so I'm sure that will come through.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Peter MacDonald Hall. As it says, Principal Consultant for at VERCIDA Group. Been at VERCIDA Group 2.5 years. Been in the diversity, inclusion, and I'm going to add the belonging space now for 20 plus years from myriad of time. My background predominantly comes from central government, starting off my D&I journey there before moving on to the private sector or local authority, I have to say. I had a stint there for a while before then being tempted to go to the private sector, dare I say, in asset management and recruitment. Very interesting, had a really exciting time there before kind of coming to VERCIDA. So that's kind of a little bit whistle-stop tour of an overview. I've got involved in everything diversity, inclusion, and everything belong. Thanks, Sarah. So let's talk about VERCIDA Group. Well, who are we? Well, VERCIDA is a composition of two elements of two businesses. So the one side of our business is VERCIDA.com. So what they do is predominantly work with employers who are absolutely looking for that diverse and global talent across all sectors, across all spheres. So the VERCIDA.com side do some fantastic work. We have a platform which is accessible and which is used by a number of our clients to amplify their job opportunities and their desire to not only attract diverse talent, and that includes people with disabilities as well the intersectionality and everything that brings, but to retain diverse talent as well. So we critically support employers in that space, and it's far more complicated. They use super algorithms and all that to monitor accessing stuff, far more clever than I could even articulate, really. But essentially, they're there to help business. They're there to help you attract that diverse talent, and leading employers now recognize and value having a diverse, and I'm going to say an inclusive workforce. Very critical to that. So diversity by itself doesn't work fundamentally, because that just brings dissent. You need to bring inclusion into the equation, where you feel valued, you feel heard, you feel respected. Critically, you are seen. And now we'll talk about belonging, and belonging is essentially around about what is it that makes you feel connected to the organization that you choose to work for, what it makes you feel that you actually belong. And critically, we are talking about those key factors around empathy, but fundamentally about psychological safety. Do you feel safe to be your authentic self? Do you trust your employer? What are those key things? So hopefully we've moved away from tick box and move into that sphere. And now it's about authentic inclusion. So that's fundamentally where we are. Can we have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about the consulting side of the business. This is fundamentally where I sit within the VERCIDA Group offering. What we do within the consulting side, first of all, we support businesses globally, although located in London. I'm working from home, as you can tell by my attic roof. So we've moved to that new hybrid model, very much so. And really, as Teresa highlighted, one of the challenges we faced during the pandemic was delivery of our services face to face. All of a sudden, we had to translate our delivery in a virtual world. So still keeping that engagement, still keeping the authenticity, still keeping that connection. And I'm glad to say that we managed to do so very, very well. If anything, my personal expectation, I was expecting things to drop off. It hasn't. If anything, it's been amplified, and that's for a number of reasons. The pandemic has highlighted for certain groups, they've done really, really well. And when we talk about disability, I would say for some, they've actually managed to thrive. It's actually given an insight for some of those pre-pandemic, what it's like to be isolated, what it feels like to be disconnected from the team. So yeah, it's kind of given a really interesting insight. And unfortunately, we had during that period the untimely death of George Floyd. So when we talk about race inclusion, that absolutely was a catalyst for change for a number of global organizations when we talk about race. But there is this tension. So the tension is that historically, lots of organizations have looked at gender, comfort, got the data, got the numbers to support that, and more recently around disability. But there is a question mark about disability. And I think there is this perception and argue that actually disability is almost the poor bedfellow in the league of inclusion as such, if I'm honest and open, because many organizations haven't really focused on disability in terms of inclusion. And the theme for discussion is about accessibility. And I am moving away from the physical accessibility. I think there's also, as well as the technical, it's also psychological accessibility when we come from our perspective. And clearly more can be done. When we look at the Paralympics, keeping the Olympic theme going, there was that campaign, We the 15. So Sarah Stays shared some fantastic stats. We the 15 was part of that global movement, recognizing that globally, 50% of the global population has a disability. What's the impact on you as an employer for you? And we have seen employers now move into the disability space, primarily now because of the pandemic, through mental health. And also, dare I say, for some sectors, through neurodiversity as well, different thinking. And we're now starting to see the value of diversity of thought and what that can help to do and amplify their business. So while it's disappointing that during the pandemic, those numbers have gone up exponentially for people from the disabled and deaf communities, hopefully employers are now reassessing, repositioning their thinking to now valuing what people with disabilities can now bring, or I like to bring with different abilities can now bring to the workplace. And I think we are on a journey there in terms of where we are. So at VERCIDA Consulting, we support global businesses and we do it across 3 spheres. Primarily, we look at training, and the training piece is what we focus on, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. But critically, we help organizations develop inclusion roadmap strategies for inclusion with supportive action plans. So we help them to be much more inclusive from that perspective. And then thirdly, we act as that critical best friend. Sometimes it's just about, can we touch base with you? What does good look like? How do we know we're on the right journey towards inclusion for all? And just so you can see, you may not have heard the term VERCIDA, it is made, but this is what it stands for. And this kind of really ties into the organizational values. So when we talk about values as an organization, how do you live your values? How do you deliver everyday inclusion? Equality. I'd almost want to spec equality for equity, bit more of a challenge there. Respect, culture, behaviors, inclusion, diversity, and as you can see, that last word, accessibility, really key, really fundamental in terms of tying in inclusion for the business. Sarah, can you have the next slide, please? Thank you. So our expertise highlights in these areas, kind of work programs, advisory, and leadership development. There's a bit of blurb about research. We're not a research organization, but it fundamentally drives our offering. And our approach is about a learning model, but I think critically, our ambition is to drive inclusion from all spheres, intersectionality. None of us here, when we think about diversity inclusion, are one facet. So I always sometimes when I'm kind of having my sessions, I say we're all diamonds. We all have different facets to ourselves, yeah? So I'm a Black man of a certain age, but now we get to the critical piece. You don't know my sexual orientation. So how are you going to get to know that? And the only way you're going to do it if I trust you fundamentally to even share that. You do not know if I have a disability hidden, because if it's physical, you can see it, you can react, you can be empathy. But if you can't see it, how do you know? So how do we build trust? How do we build empathy? So actually we can start to have the conversation that actually, how can we move to you being brave enough to even having the conversation around that piece? So we all bring different facets. And when we look at an age perspective, we know now the intergenerational 5 generations at work. We know the Alpha generation and Generation Z don't like labels, you know, don't label me. Let's move away from that, recognize for me my uniqueness. And I think there's a challenge there around hiring. There's a challenge there for organizations. How can we hire inclusively, authentically, rather than kind of let our biases kind of take over? So we do a lot of work around bias mitigation, but critically, we also do a lot of work with leaders around what is it to be an inclusive leader? What is it you need to change about your leadership style? How do you flex it to connect authentically, to promote and explore team inclusion, collaboration, psychological safety? How do you kind of get the best out of your diverse group? Because the fact is, the world is changing ever quicker. It's fundamentally very complex. We've seen that with the pandemic. Nobody foresaw that, and there's been that. But the key critical aspect is around diversity is here. We live in a global village, and there's a challenge. If we're going to be successful and to be inclusive, we need to be kind of doing that in a systematic way and recognize the value that we all bring to the table, so to speak, in that regard. So when we talk about diversity and being inclusive, it's really key and really fundamental, and it's core to who we are at VERCIDA, to supporting employers to create that culture of inclusion. Next slide, please. Oh, it's just me. Okay, so again, if you're interested, I encourage you, for those of you baby boomers and all that, kind of Google, you know, Google us, VERCIDA Group online, find out more about us, what we do and how you can support. If again, if you're looking for employment, definitely encourage you to sign up to the vercida.com website. So yeah, to both sides, employee.com as an employer, again, happy to talk to you further about the work that we do and see how we can sort of support you, work together going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. And I think, like Teresa, you've covered a lot of ground in a very short space of time. So thank you very much. And, you know, there's lots to touch on there, that empathy, that authenticity, that authentic leadership, unconscious bias. I think, yeah, and I know you've got a wealth of information on your site. But for now we will move on, and I'll welcome Heather, who, as well as thinking about all those elements of diversity, has a whole range of diverse workplaces that I know you have to consider from a national trust, and I know that's something that you're going to focus on for us now. So I'll hand over to you, and really looking forward to hearing all about it.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Teresa and Peter, for such great presentations. You've the joy of going last sometimes, although it's nerve-wracking waiting, is that so many people before me have said some of the things I was going to say, but there's a lot of different stuff as well. So I'll move on to that now. So my role is the Trust Equality Specialist, working out of our Operations Directorate and leading predominantly on accessibility for disabled people. I work across all our other directorates to do that, perhaps at the moment principally with our people department, which is what we call HR, and our inclusion team, which is part of that department, and our curation and experiences department as well, who are predominantly looking after the care of our places, customer service, and programming the experiences that people can have when they come and visit us. So those crucial things that are really important for diversity and also for belonging, to pick up on the theme that Peter was talking about as part of his presentation. And recently as well, I've been leading on the accessibility work, which forms part of our commitment to Everyone Welcome, which I'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. I've been with the Trust quite a while in a range of different roles, but always with access for disabled people as the main part of what I do. And next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So I thought I'd start with a few facts and figures about the Trust. First of all, just the fact that we cover England, Wales and Northern Ireland. National Trust for Scotland is a different and separate charity. So the National Trust I work for works across those 3 countries. And some stats about the size of the organisation and that variety, which brings about those variety of workplaces that Sarah was mentioning. We have over 780 miles of coastline, over 250,000 hectares of land, over 500 historic houses, castles, parks and gardens, and there is an awful lot more built structure than is mentioned in that little bullet point there in that number 500, but the list would go on if I tried to name everything. We have over 470 holiday cottages and other places of accommodation, and by other places of accommodation I would mean things like campsites and our base camps. We have lots of group activities. And then nearly 1 million works of art in our collections, so a huge number of things that we care for. And then around 8,000 to 10,000 staff and around 50,000 volunteers. So just to finish off that last bullet, those are the most recent stats that I could find for us coming from our AGM publications. So you can see that we are a huge organisation. I've worked for the Trust for quite a number of years, and we've grown and grown and grown over that time. So we have an amazing amount of opportunity and diversity in what we have. We have to think about how our people can respond to that, and we can create diversity amongst our people to do that too. Lots of different workplaces within this structure and setup. Next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So thinking about it from a broader perspective, to bring all that variety of opportunity and experience together, we have our wider strategy for everyone forever. And this is the midterm review, if you like, of our 10-year strategy, which we started our 10-year strategy in 2015. So again, 2020 was another big moment for us, for other reasons we'll come on to, and that we were doing our midterm review. And it was a particular challenge to do that, given the pandemic, as we all know, happening in 2020. And some of you might be familiar with our centenary motto from some 26, I think it is, years ago now, forever for everyone, so switching the words around. But actually that switch of the words around is really a signal that we're going to be thinking much more about people, be they ones who are already connected to us in some way, or could be if we develop and talk about that totality that I listed out before for you, that we have the opportunities to connect. And we could learn from people what we could be and what they might want us to be and what they might want us to do. So it was really about putting people in all forms at the forefront of our thinking. The strategy itself is available online, and I put together some links on one of the slides at the end of the presentation, which Sarah's making available. So you'll be able to look at that. So I won't go into detail about it here. But of relevance today really is the commitment within the strategy of we will reflect our values by welcoming everyone and valuing the diversity of our people and supporters. The mention of values segues into the next bullet point on the slide, which was just to acknowledge that as part of our strategy review, we also refreshed our values and we're very clear about our aim of welcoming everyone. We have 4 values and I have committed them to memory. So the other 3 are love people and places, think now and forever. So the forever word hasn't gone. And make it happen, which is really about making sure that we get on and do the work and become a faster moving and faster paced organisation than we are often known for. And that determination to affect change also comes within that make it happen value. But back to that strategy commitment, it really means that we will be increasing the skills and capabilities of our staff and volunteers, building more confidence in that variety of things we care for and everything that we need to do to make sure that we keep everything in really good condition, provide people with great experiences. We're going to be improving access to our places, access in all its forms, but particularly including accessibility for disabled people. And we'll do this work through partnerships and through testing new ideas. And even more so now than it was when we actually wrote the strategy, we'll be thinking about being careful financially for both the short and the long term. And through doing all of this work and through really thinking about the variety we have, the opportunity, and some of the things that Peter was saying as part of how we set ourselves up, we really hope that we're going to be able to increase the diversity of our workforce, a term that I'll use to cover both staff and volunteers, and also think about how we might need to flex our workplaces and the design of those workplaces as we embrace that diversity. And working out of the same sorts of places all the time, and not just because of the pandemic, which I'll come on to the changes that made, but I'm sitting today in the beautiful Peak District in one of their office spaces. I've spent the past year and a half mostly sitting in my front room, and then I'm often in an office space, or most usually I was working out of my car. So you have to be quite adaptable with the way that a number of our roles are set up. And we have to think about the accessibility and achievability of that for a whole range of people if we want to improve the diversity of our workforce. And all of this isn't really new stuff for us, but what's new for us is to put people so far to the forefront of what we're aiming to achieve. That's the next point, our commitment to everyone welcome. So switching those words around again. There is more information again about this commitment available online, and it's really all about belonging, picking up again on some of the things that Peter said actually, and relevance and being welcoming. To sum it up in a line from the strategy, we are working to create a culture that values difference, includes everyone, and recognises the strength that comes from diversity. We recognise we have a long way to go, but we're determined to be for everyone forever. And I think that last sentence about recognising that we're not there yet and recognising we have a lot to do is really crucial to the energy to actually doing that work and making it happen, as I was saying before, is one of our crucial values. Peter has outlined just a huge size of the task, but we have a determination to work harder at it and be better at it than we were before. And everyone welcome covers all the work that we'll do across all of our places, as I was saying just there. And to do the work, we need to work differently, as I've also been intimating. And we've been bringing people together in different teams. So picking up from part of my introduction, our people will be working across different departments increasingly. So for example, I work with our inclusion team, our specialist advisors in heritage, historic buildings and landscapes, our HR teams, as I said, and our active outdoors teams. And I just wanted to spend a little minute thinking about our outdoor spaces, because we're often seen as an organisation which cares for buildings, and the huge amount of landscape that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation that we care for gets rather forgotten about. But actually, it's in those places that many people can make their first connection with heritage and start to become interested in what the National Trust is all about. Certainly when I was thinking about the National Trust, I remembered my first interaction with it was a huge parkland. It wasn't the traditional mansion or objects or any of that. It was really that outdoor space, and becoming really fascinated with how it maintained itself in such wonderful repair. Who did that? What did they do? That was my entry point to thinking about working with this organisation. We have an urban programme as well, so thinking about developing links with our cities and creating those new partnerships. And that brings me to the other point on the slide, collaboration and partnership. To enable our strategy to work, we need to do a lot more of this, and we recognise that as a key plank of the delivery of the strategy right at the beginning, rather than trying to do everything ourselves. As wonderful and diverse as our people might be, you get far better results and get far further when you work in collaboration with other people. And in 2019, as an example of this, in September 2019, we agreed a partnership with the Alzheimer's Society, thinking about how our aspirations to becoming more accessible for disabled people, with the aim of developing the capability of our staff to welcoming people living with dementia and creating more dementia-friendly environments, in a nutshell. And this is a model that was going to grow, as was that multidisciplinary team approach and working with other individuals and small organisations locally as partners. But then, as I get to the end of that slide, COVID-19, and that little image that was also on the earlier slides there of the COVID cell that we all became so familiar with, sadly. Next slide, please, Sarah. So we had all those wonderful aspirations, those ideas of thinking about our workplaces. What would it mean? How could people work differently? How could we adapt what we were doing so that people could have more opportunities with us? And then we had a pandemic to contend with, as we all did. And the impact, I'm sure, is felt by so many of you, if not all of you, listening to the webinar today. So like all organisations, we had to have all those grand plans and move away from them and think about tackling something that we hadn't tackled before. And the first thing we did was overhaul all our policies and procedures and introduce some new processes to bring into what all this government guidance meant for us. And it was not easy, as I'm sure you all found out. And at the height of the pandemic, we had about 80% of our staff on furlough and no volunteers, certainly no visitors on site, but no volunteers on site at the beginning of everything, as we took care of our people as much as we were abiding by government guidance. Many of our volunteers are in the age bracket defined as at a higher risk from the virus. Some, as with some of our staff, had underlying health conditions which put them at a higher risk. And I mention this because it also impacts on how we are recovering from the impact of COVID-19, which obviously continues, but also that general desire to return to work in the way that people have been working up to 2019. And that includes the workplaces that people were choosing to work from. And we had to manage the many different responses of our members and visitors, again, some sympathetic and some not. And again, this impacted on a number of our staff, particularly those working in our outdoor roles. But we had to keep going whilst we lost income overnight, lost members, no visitor admission fees or anything at all. And whilst we were doing all of that, we had to plan for the future whenever we thought that things might ease. and resetting for the future, as the slide says, as we come towards the end of this particular section. And we had to think about this in a way that was actually really tough, because we had to make some redundancies onto that bullet point. Around 15% of our staff and some of our volunteers decided that they didn't want to return. We lost a significant amount of income, and we knew that we were going to have to keep doing the day job differently for some time to come. With such a lot of people, we hadn't much option anyway, but we had to think about what that impact meant on that work balance for people. And it's not an unusual tale at the moment to be thinking about what this would mean for the future. But we were adamant that we were going to keep going on our Everyone Welcome commitment and keep that central to our recovery. And I think what was interesting for me, and I was one of the 20% of staff that kept working all the way through and thinking about, flexing all of our policies and approaches, as I say, it helped us just to understand really how far away we were from Everyone Welcome at the centre of our thinking. So I talked earlier about recognising we had a lot more to do. And actually, the pandemic really brought it into sharp focus, particularly when it came to how people did their jobs and where they did them from at the moment and what that might look like in the future. But we did keep it central, and we faced into the challenges, and we did think about how we could reintroduce aspects of our 2019 and before, if I can put it like that, working life carefully, but also how things might just permanently change. And I think Teresa talked a lot about aspects here that impacted on us as well in her presentation as we did that. And there was a change of work circumstances, as I've been saying, working from home, as we've already talked about, when people were not used to it. The impact of that, it was isolating for some people. Being on furlough brought its own stresses, particularly for people who were on furlough for almost a year, as some of my direct colleagues were. Getting access to technology, we talked about that earlier on, and accessible technology wasn't always easy. And for many of our staff, their usual workplace was not sat in front of a computer. So it was getting used to a new way of doing work, a new tool to use to do work, as well as thinking about how accessible it was for people who perhaps had chosen the profession away from the type of work that we were doing on our computers for very specific reasons, and reasons relating to disability often as well. And we also found that people who didn't need any further support with their usual desk setup and their usual workplace found that they actually did, because they were now working at kitchen tables or using other surfaces in their houses as tables, because not all of our work-life experience at home, our personal circumstances, makes it easy to pivot to taking your office into your own home and personal space. And I think hindsight's a wonderful thing for some of the approaches that we took and could have taken, but we learnt an awful lot about the conditions our staff were working in, how we had to improve those, and what that would mean for us moving forward if we really wanted to capitalise on our Everyone Welcome commitment. And on to the next and final slide, please, Sarah. What was becoming apparent to us, as I say, as we went through all of this, was the need to support our people more, and particularly our disabled people. And Sarah and Teresa outlined earlier on the impact of the pandemic on employers, but also on disabled people ourselves. And there's so much research and so much in the media about the impact of the pandemic. And it felt to me like, as a disabled person myself working for the Trust, there was a way that we could actually raise our voices even louder at this time, and that it was important that we did so. And we just wanted to make sure that as an organisation, we created the change that we were being told we needed to create. We reset our Everyone Welcome approach effectively, and brought the methodology of that collaboration and partnership I talked about earlier on, but very much with our own people, bringing that much more into that sharp focus. And just to go down the slide to think of some of the things that we've done, just to finish, well-being was a clear focus. And I think we are all very aware that the mental health impact on every one of us in some way or another the last 18 months has been significant. And we reshaped some of our approaches to bring in a dedicated role, part of another existing role that we had, to really support well-being and make that a key part of our revised strategy, if you like, and develop a strategy for it on its own. We did lots of things to sort of highlight mental health, but actually we weren't bringing it all together. We weren't taking that step back and thinking about all these little facets of things. What do they really mean? And what do they say about our organisation-wide commitment? And a lot of our disabled colleagues have been talking about mental health and the added impact on them. And it's been really interesting just to see how we can pivot from these small interventions to really thinking about it more strategically. And we'd started to develop a culture of training and support, sorry, is the next point there. We had begun to increase the amount of training that we were making available for our staff and volunteers. And it's all on online at the moment for obvious reasons, but we started to think about, have we actually got the right information in our development? What else do we need to add? And how can this help us to understand the diversity of opportunity that we have, but how we can increase the diversity of our people to take those opportunities? And something that was also very relevant to us thinking about diversity of people and improving the diversity of our workforce going forward was our staff networks. We'd started to develop a culture of staff networks before the pandemic, but we didn't have one for disabled staff. But we launched one in June 2020, pandemic notwithstanding, because we were hearing, as I said before, that disabled people wanted to come together, raise those voices and take this time to challenge the organisation to recover better, to explain how difficult things had been before the pandemic and how challenging things were now. There's a lot of input here from our staff who travel around for their job, like I do, like I was explaining earlier, and a lot from our outdoor teams. And as I talked earlier about how our outdoor properties are often not thought about as much as our buildings. So it was feeling for our staff too, and the provisions we were making for disabled staff working in those outdoor environments. And to finish off, as a consequence, we already have a much more effective reasonable adjustments process now. Again, a bit like well-being, it was very fragmented before and often existed principally in my inbox. But we brought all our advice together and taken soundings from our staff network, which we call workability, as to what was missing, how the process worked or didn't, and what needed changing. And it's a timely moment to talk about this because we launched our new process yesterday. A soft launch, as we need to do some testing, but it is already so much better to have everything together in one place, to have a really clear line of sight through all the information, and really importantly, some centralized funding to help to finance those reasonable adjustments, which is something that we didn't have before, but we've really changed our process of understanding where that resource and support needs to come from. And that collaborative process of developing the advice was so much better as well, and a great example of how listening and conversation and transparency really helps us learn more about what we need to do and how we need to change. And I'll finish on that point that actually it's that dialogue and collaboration that's been so transformational for us and will mean that our everyone welcome changes will have inclusion and inclusive practice at its heart right from the very start. So dialogue, discussion, listening and learning are the keys that we've found to setting ourselves off again, sort of post-pandemic, but not quite, on the right foot to create much more inclusive workplaces for our people. And thank you, Sarah. I think you might have the slide next with the links. I'm not sure. That might be later on in the pack. So.
Thank you ever so much. Another really, really rich whistle-stop tour there, but lots of activity. You can see those challenges, the acceleration, the journey that you've been on. But yeah, just wanted to move on to our panel discussion and just dig into some of these themes really. I was wondering if maybe I can come back to you, Peter, because you talked a little bit about that intersectionality, which I think is something that has been touched on in all presentations. But you know, what is the position of accessibility within the diversity and inclusion agenda, and how can we better integrate the two? I think that's a challenge I'm sure Teresa would agree with. So it'd be good to hear from you, Peter, first, and then come on to other voices as well.
Sure. I think the point was really made by Heather really in that last slide about inclusion at the start. So really when we're thinking about accessibility, let's get it in our thinking from the outset, and rather than from an add-on later on in the process. So when we are thinking about the accessibility, I'm looking at it very much in terms of, yes, the tech, yes, AbilityNet specializes in, but I'm also thinking about the accessibility in terms of access to leadership, the culture piece, very much from that aspect. But it's when we're accessible and inclusive, so if we come from an inclusive mindset, I think we automatically think about inclusion. That's my bias. We think about actually how are people connecting, how are people teaming. So when we move into the challenge about the virtual space, that Teresa and Heather really kind of nicely highlighted some of the challenges and the opportunities that it affords. We think about the accessibility about socialization of a team. How can we connect teams in a virtual space authentically? Because when we look at hybrid working, for an example, there is clearly now the new normal is probably 3 days at work if you want to do that, 2 days at home, or whichever way works for you. There is a temptation to move to face-to-face engagement. I feel, however, we may need to keep that virtual meeting. So from a manager, even when I'm in the office, I need to keep that virtual meeting. So everybody, so as well as doing face-to-face meetings, I want to do virtual meetings because it affords the ability to connect everybody. And there's a bit of bias at play because I think there's a tension that if I have close proximity to a manager, I can feel they can see the good stuff that I'm doing. The challenge is if I'm in a virtual workspace away from my manager who doesn't have line of sight of what I do, my challenge then is how am I perceived? How am I going to show that I'm of value? Because we know home workers always give that bit more. Like part-time workers always seem to give that more than full-time workers. They do as much in 3 days as somebody does over 5 days. And I think one of the spin-offs from the pandemic has been really the effectiveness of workers. So when we talk about accessibility within the D&I agenda, it's around that inclusion. It's around making sure everyone has fair and equal access, not just through the tech, but also that we mitigate the biases that can prevent some groups benefiting than others.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a couple of questions that have come in. So one in particular, just to put to the panelists, any advice on how we might measure inclusion, diversity, and in particular, accessibility? And I know, Peter, you touched on that without just ticking boxes. So Teresa, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the accessibility piece there, on how you would actually measure that or measure all of that stuff and then open that up.
I think sort of measuring it as in sort of providing some sort of means of feedback, I think is what we need to have, is normalizing sort of like that way of feeding back to whether everybody's being included in discussions. And I know Peter had mentioned about sort of like the virtual office and working and having these virtual meetings, and that's really important as well. So you know, when you're face to face with somebody, you get that nuance of body language going on and you can pick up on that. And if you've got a hybrid office, that means that some have that advantage, whereas when they're working from home, they haven't. So maybe asking all your staff to have that virtual meeting, even if they're in the office, might be a solution to reduce those nuances of advantage that people get from being in the office with their line managers, maybe. To get the feedback as to whether that's working or not. Those are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about, as in providing accessible tools to have feedback. So using surveys, for instance, is a really good way, and you can do that within sort of a meeting maybe. Or it could be that you want to have a look at your whole organization and using something like a tool that assesses an individual need, so that you can address each person's individual sort of barriers and solutions that would support them, and that makes everybody included. Basically, we're looking at everybody individually. So there's some different ways in which you can get that feedback, I think.
Heather, you talked about your inbox, which is that's not the most scientific method, but it's definitely a temperature check, isn't it? How do you measure your progress?
Yeah, it was something that was pulled up as part of why we needed to change the process, to be honest, because I can't possibly keep statistics when I'm trying to help staff who need support. So we realized that it wasn't effective if everything was just coming into one person. But it did help capture some trends, and that's what we're looking at. I think, you know, moving forward, we're thinking about how we can see the sorts of things that come up regularly as feedback to our reasonable adjustments process, the sorts of things that are requested. We do have Teresa talking about surveys, we have a staff survey which we're asking some very particular questions focusing on inclusion and belonging in now. And we're not going to necessarily ask the same questions every year because it will take longer for a year for impact to be felt. But what we're going to do is actually put in place some of the things that we are being asked to do and the answers to those questions, and then measure those in the next survey to see if we've actually moved things forward. So we are looking at the survey approach, and we're also looking at, you know, some better tools in terms of how we actually record the information, and not just for our workforce diversity, but also for implementing, you know, accessibility improvements at our properties. So I've got a meeting tomorrow, quite honestly, about how we would measure those more effectively so that we can see we're making really good demonstrable change for our visitors, which would hopefully encourage more people to want to come and work and volunteer volunteer with us. So we're looking at different ways of using tools and different ways of using surveys to really capture that information. And our staff networks are the best source of feedback and trend giving, really, because there's a lot of really rich information there, which will help us realise what we need to focus on, and also where we're doing well, so we can start to build that picture of feedback from people directly themselves.
And sadly we're running out of time, but Peter, any thoughts from you on any specific tools or tips for measuring progress?
Yeah, well, really, I mean, in terms of tools, you said about the survey, my thing about staff employment survey is brilliant, but as long as we're able to kind of slice and dice, so we can tell about differential experience. So many times, sometimes I look at engagement surveys and they give me breakdown by business area, which is great. However, when we can slice and dice that, for example, people with disabilities, we can capture that feedback. That then tells me if there's any specific interventions that we need. So are they having fair and equal access to career opportunities? And are they moving through the organization? Are they getting fair and equal access to training? Do they have good relationships with their managers? So picking up on the point that Heather made about asking those specific inclusion and belonging questions, when I slice and dice that by ethnicity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, etc., I'm able to identify, great, because you know what? It's not about capturing the bad stuff. Sometimes when we do that, there's some surprisingly very good stuff. So, and that then allows an organization to then tell that story. So there's two motives there. One is about the data and the numbers. That's only one part. The other part is about the story. So you don't have to be big about that. If you have you could be a small organization, but actually the actual workplace experience of disabled people is fantastic. Who do you tell? Who knows about that? Who feels that? And actually, if you can capture that element from your data, this is now how we use data to tell and amplify diversity, because it's part of your brand. And enlightened organizations are fully aware of this. It adds to their brand value. So when you're accessible to all, you're attracting your future talent. You're telling your partners and your suppliers who are actively now looking to work with organizations on this agenda. We're here, this is what we're visible, and we're doing it. It's not about having the policy. It's not about having that sheet of paper that gets dusty on the shelf. You're living it and you're breathing it, and people are feeling it. And that's empowering, and that's how we can move forward.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And I think that's a lovely note to end on, because sadly I do need to bring things to a close, but I know that I've really enjoyed the session today, and I hope all our attendees have as well. And I think, there is a real sense of an ongoing journey that we're all taking together. But thank you to all the panelists for sharing what stage of the journey you're at. And I think there's been some amazing tips that have come through in the session today. There are some more training sessions coming up. This will be shared as part of the slides with a discount code. As Heather touched on, there's also some more resources from ourselves and from the National Trust, and those links there from Peter earlier. So all that remains is for me to say thank you again to everyone. And to finish there. So thank you ever so much. Watch out for the email, watch out for the details coming through, and thanks ever so much, everybody. Thank you and goodbye.